Ever since he was a kid, Daniel Stone has been living with that sinking feeling.
Wherever you are on Earth, you're never more than 2 miles from a shipwreck.
But it's a shipwreck 2 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic that intrigues him the most, and he's not alone. The story of the Titanic has been told and retold since the night it sank in 1912. But the tale rarely told is what happened after that night to remember, including the race to find the wreck, the harebrained schemes to raise it, and the difficulties inherent in finding anything below the surface of the seas.
It is easier to see and map the surface of Neptune and Pluto than it is to map the ocean floor.
In his new book, Sinkable, available at the Novel Neighbor, Daniel Stone, a former staff writer for National Geographic and a former White House correspondent for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, weaves a fascinating story of history and science, uncovering the untold story of the Titanic not as a ship, but as a shipwreck.
I would love to see it. I think of all the kind of cultural artifacts in the world, when you think of the pyramids and, King Tut and Machu Picchu, the Titanic really is one of them. And as long as it's still there, and it will be there for a while longer, it's one of the great wrecks of all time, and especially it's one of the great stories of the 20th century.
Daniel Stone, welcome to St. Louis. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
I guess it's apt someone named Stone doing a book about things that sink, but what is your fascination with these shipwrecks?
I grew up, I think, as a lot of young kids, especially boys, grow up loving ships, loving things that sail, the ocean, and hearing these fabulous tales of old shipwrecks, mysterious ones laden with gold that sank, deadly ones, mysterious ones, and it's a fascinating world that has stuck with me.
And you hit us right off the bat with this astounding figure of how many shipwrecks there are out there. You kind of toy this of, do you think there's 1,000? Do you think there's 5,000? What's the actual number?
I have asked this question to almost everyone I've met for several years, and everyone gets it wrong. We think of shipwrecks in kind of the big sense, the A-list celebrity shipwrecks, the Titanic, Lusitania, the Endurance, right? You and I could probably name a few dozen if we tried. But when you consider there are ships that have been used for entire human history all over the world as the only way to get around before the advent of planes and cars, the number's way bigger. According to UNESCO, it is 3 million shipwrecks in every ocean, lake, river, body of water on Earth.
We're talking ships, not like some little fishing trawler that sank.
Ships, yeah. And UNESCO says that's a guess, and the number is probably a lot higher. And when you account for fishing trawlers and speedboats and day pontoons, the number could be as high as 30 million, but we don't know.
Well, of course, we're on rivers here where there are a lot of sunken steamboats that pop up every once in a while when the rivers get kind of low. And as we speak doing this interview, in Europe, where the water is dropping, I've seen that they've got all kinds of World War II and World War I ships suddenly popping up.
We're learning about new wrecks every day, largely as a result of climate change and falling lakes and rivers. People don't realize that shipwrecks don't need to be contained to the ocean. And when I tell people there are shipwrecks in St. Louis, Missouri, in Kansas City, there are shipwrecks in the deserts of Namibia. There was even a wreck found under the Twin Towers when they fell in New York City, an old 300-year-old merchant ship. Wherever you are on Earth, you're never more than 2 miles from a shipwreck.
And so with that said, then, why go to the Titanic as the shipwreck of record for your book?
Well, I wondered that title alone. Why is it the shipwreck of record? Why this one ship that's not that unique in almost any characteristic? How did it become like the Beatles of shipwrecks, The most famous North Star that has not just fame and celebrity to it, but an entire century large economy built around it that shows no signs of flagging either, with new generations inspired by its story.
Well, and you point out a couple of reasons why that is, and I thought that was kind of fascinating too, starting with contrary to the idea of, women and children first, that's kind of a myth, except in this case.
It worked.
It worked, and that's why.
There's only one thing about the Titanic that really stands apart, and it's my theory of why this shipwreck became what it did. It was not, the biggest ship ever built. There had been bigger ships, built throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and the Titanic was the biggest for a moment. There had been ships for rich people for a long time. There had been ships that hit icebergs so many times in the 1880s and 90s that by the time the Titanic comes, shipwreck iceberg strikes had become rare, right? And it had been considered unsinkable, but so had a lot of ships before, made out of steel. The one thing that's different is a weird quirk of numbers that 1,500 people died, but 700 people lived. And those 700 people were mostly young women and children who lived another 50, 60 years before, they died. And in that time, they kept the details swirling, their stories they kept telling, writing them in books. And their lifespans kind of coincided with this growth of culture and technology that coincided with the growth of movies and music, mass distribution of books that allowed these details to get out and really permeate the pop culture in a way that a shipwreck 100 years prior never would have.
Well, one of the things that really caught my eye, again, toward the beginning of the book, was the fact that, and I guess I realized this, but never really thought about it, that icebergs kind of come and go. It's not like I was going to say the ice caps, but those
are going. Yeah.
It was just a little slower. But the iceberg that killed the Titanic was almost gone.
It was very close to gone. I mean, this was a sheet of ice that started in Greenland 3 years prior, and it was bigger than the Colosseum in Rome, right? A giant stadium-sized piece of ice. By the time it gets to where the Titanic is, it's a big piece of ice, one you wouldn't put in a cocktail, but, not, maybe we're talking a couple houses, maybe. It had taken several kind of meandering routes through the Labrador Current down from Greenland. Most icebergs melt by that point. This was kind of a 1 in 1,000 iceberg. And if it had come an hour before, even 10 minutes before, it would have been off course. If it had come 2 weeks later, it would have been completely melted. But its exact position was exactly on target to obviously hit this ship and then become the most famous iceberg and create the most famous ship and shipwreck ever built.
Well, there's all kinds of fascinating facts and figures in here, but it is a character-driven story. And you've got, I guess, 3 sort of main characters, and they are characters, who were going to try to, at various points in history, bring the Titanic, well, first find it, and then bring the Titanic up and exploit it for every dime they could get out of it. I mean, these guys, some of them were hucksters, some of them were incompetent, at least delusional, probably is something. But what struck me as interesting before we get into all those 3 guys is the fact that all of them got all of this publicity, free publicity from a very willing press. You were a reporter, White House reporter, so you know what it's like to try to hold people to account for things. How is it that the press just bought all the stuff that these guys said that, they were just making up out of whole cloth?
They wanted to. It was too good a story to think too critically about. The first character, as you mentioned, was right after the Titanic sank in 1914, an architect and mining engineer in Denver, of all places, landlocked Denver, has this grand plan to find and salvage the Titanic. And because he was a mining engineer, the press gave him the authority of saying he knew what he was talking about, finding the ship by sending out electromagnets that would attract themselves to the hull of the Titanic and raise them up on giant winches. Anyone who knows anything about engineering knows that would never work for a number of reasons. But it was a salacious story. It was sensational, almost, to think of this famous wreck, all of these recently dead people, and a way to get it back. I mean, that alone, those elements worked. It worked half a century later again with Doug Woolley, the second character, who also has kind of a zany plan. He lives in London. He's never even been on a boat. And yet he becomes the guy who's going to kind of craft this narrative and this story and gets written up all over the world for his kind of zany ideas. And the third guy, briefly, was an oil prospector, Jack Grimm, in Texas, who went looking in 1980, and he came extremely close on account of having a lot of money. He rented a boat, he got a crew, he almost found it. And if not for a couple hundred feet being off course, he might have been the guy who found the Titanic.
But as it turned out, none of them found it.
None of them found it.
Else found it. And yet Woolley, who's sort of the main character of the three characters, claims that still, I guess, because he's still alive and you've met him, that he owns the wreck of the Titanic.
Yeah. He started this in the late 50s, really crested in the mid-60s. He decides he wants to own the Titanic. And he finds kind of a weird quirk about the Titanic after it sank, which is that nobody wanted it. The White Star Line that built it and sailed it had gone defunct. The insurers who had paid out insurance claims on it, they didn't really want anything to do with it. It was a big scarlet letter for the whole shipping industry. And the survivors and the families of the victims, they didn't really want any piece of it, nor did anyone believe it could ever be gotten. No one even knew where it was. So he puts these ads in newspapers that say, the Titanic is mine, I claim it. If anyone challenges me, you have 2 weeks. Otherwise, it's mine. He says no one challenged him, and so he declares it his. He tells reporters, they print their stories. He leverages those stories to other reporters, and he gets written up all over the world as the man who owns the Titanic.
It's like squatters' rights.
Yeah. And to the question of whether it's a lie, people have wondered, did he lie his way to this thing? He really believed it. He really believed this was possible. He really believed it was his. And, if you believe it, it still might not be true, but it really became part of his identity.
Well, it's probably easy to do, too, because the salvage laws, I gather, are as kind of murky as the ocean.
Oh, yes. Ships and law in general are a very murky zone. You consider a ship is built in one country, registered usually in another. It sails to a third country holding cargo, from several other countries and citizens from several other countries. And so when a ship goes down, especially in open water, deep ocean water, all these countries and all these parties tend to claim some part of it. And it gets caught up usually in big international court battles. That's true for cultural wrecks like the Titanic and the Lusitania. It's especially true for valuable wrecks, the ones carrying hundreds of millions of dollars of gold and treasure. Suddenly everyone claims that a piece of it is theirs.
The attitude about shipwrecks has changed over the years. There are some that have been found, brought to the surface, and exploited, frankly. And I suppose if they ever do raise the Titanic, that'll be the one that'll get exploited. But the attitude of the public has changed a little bit, I gather, about the ethics of particularly a ship like the Titanic, where so many people died. It is a graveyard.
Yeah. It used to be considered a holy graveyard that you didn't want to touch for economic and cultural reasons, spiritual reasons. You didn't want to get caught up in it. Fortunately, the Titanic is really deep and it's really mangled. There's not much structure to it. So it'll never be pulled up as a ship. There's no ship to pull up. But starting in the 80s and the 90s, excavators started to pull up artifacts. Thousands of artifacts. And these artifacts now exist. You could go see them in museum exhibits. The biggest one is in Atlanta. It's a private media group that holds museum exhibits that travel around the world. And you could see the cups and saucers, the books, the picture frames, sometimes the boots and clothing of the passengers. But the ship itself will never really be pulled up.
It's not really possible. Probably.
No. So, one engineer described it to me as trying to salvage the Twin Towers after they fell. You could pick up a lot of pieces, but there's no structure to the whole thing anymore. It's just mangled metal and wood.
I thought it was interesting, too, you talk about in the book the fact that for all of our technology, and it gets better every day, but still we really can't see down deep into the ocean from satellites and, whatever equipment we have.
No, it is easier to see the surface of Neptune and map the surface of Neptune and Pluto than it is to map the ocean floor. And the reason is we make maps of land with micro radio waves that a satellite sends down, they bounce back. But those waves don't work in water. They just get stuck. So really the only way to see underwater is with sound, with sonar, and it sends these signals down to the ocean surface and they bounce back. But you essentially have to drag a sonar rig over the ocean floor very laboriously back and forth. When you consider how much ocean we have, That amount of work is a multi-trillion-dollar project over many years. And also, for what, right? I mean, we want to see these wrecks. We certainly want to take interest in parts of the ocean. But do we really need to know every rock outcrop and piece of old ship and, whale skeleton that's sitting on the ocean floor? Probably not.
Well, and at one point, as I recall from the book, you also talk about Disney once had an interest in this?
Disney, National Geographic, every media company has expressed some interest over the 20th century of being part of the media leader in finding the Titanic. It would be this major media event in the 60s, 70s, and 80s before it was found. And indeed it was. But when these media companies kind of confronted the fact that you're searching the deep sea, which is very deep, you need to rent, an enormous amount of very expensive and highly technical equipment operated by very experienced people. The price tag gets into the millions of dollars without even the guarantee of finding it. And they all kind of realized that and closed up and turned away.
Imagine the liability insurance for going to try to find the Titanic.
And they wouldn't even get a guarantee. So, yeah.
Exactly. But you point out in the book the 1970s was sort of a zenith for interest in shipwrecks. People, I guess maybe because there's lots of valuable stuff down there.
Lots of valuable stuff that was found and rumored to be, especially off the coast of Florida, North Carolina, and the Caribbean, where Spanish ships used to carry a lot of gold. But also the 70s coincided with big advances in underwater technology, the ability to look deeper and the ability to salvage. I mean, when you think of like a carnival game, like a big claw that goes down and grabs a treasure chest full of gold coins, that really didn't exist as an option until really the 1970s. And that ability, that technological ability, kind of yielded this gold rush for people getting new boats and new equipment and going to find things that prior civilizations, even a decade or two prior, people could not do. So there really was a gold rush of the seas in the 1970s.
It's like that scene in Jaws when they put the bounty out, yes, and then like every fisherman in town starts heading out there. And of course, you talk about a lot of other wrecks and salvage operations in the book besides the Titanic, and they're all fascinating. But one that really, sadly, was interesting is the Challenger.
Yeah.
The space shuttle that blew up. And you talk about that and then some other things that they found and some ironies in that.
Well, we think of shipwrecks as ships, and most of them are, but we have put a lot of other things in the oceans, certainly to make artificial reefs. Think of motorhomes, subway cars, toilets, water heaters, everything has been dumped in the ocean. But also things unintentionally put in the ocean. And the Challenger is the biggest example, right? The Challenger takes off 1986, Cape Canaveral, Florida. Within minutes, it explodes and it falls into the Atlantic. And NASA has this immediate interest to pick up all of the pieces, not just to find out what happened and try to reverse engineer this disaster, but also it doesn't want pieces of mangled space shuttle washing up on beaches, becoming big news stories all over the world. So they send out more than 200 divers and basically an all hands on deck scenario over 2 months to find as many pieces of the shuttle as possible, large and small, and of course the crew cabin with the bodies of the crew before they could be, lost and found. And they found something else sort of by mistake in doing that. By pure coincidence, the price tag of the Challenger search was $13 million. And on the last day of the search, some of these divers see something black floating in the water. They get closer. Turns out to be a duffel bag filled with dozens of bricks of high-quality cocaine that they surmised fell off some smuggler's boat somewhere. They bring it back to the lab. They have it valued. It is valued at exactly $13 million. They joke that the search paid for itself.
Wow. Incredible. There's a fellow down in Australia, Clive Palmer, wants to build a new Titanic?
There are a few Titanics that exist now, replicas. There are 2 in the U.S., one in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and one in Branson, Missouri, that are both half-scale replicas of half of the ship. Clive Palmer is an Australian businessman who about 10 years ago said, I want to build a real full-scale replica of the Titanic that will actually sail, and people can book bookings on it. It'll sail the exact route from Southampton to New York. And it will be this kind of big gimmick of the cruise industry that people worldwide will want to sail on. He has not yet started construction. It is a large kind of media promise. He certainly has the money to do it, but whether he has the tenacity and fortitude to actually get it done is a question. For the main reason that the Titanic today would not be very impressive as a ship, right? This was a big ship in its day. Compared to today's much bigger cruise ships, the Titanic was not very big. It also did not and would not, if built again, have the amenities that you expect on cruise ships today, swimming pools and skydiving and whatnot. It would not have internet. It would not have all sorts of things that cruise travelers expect. Would people pay top dollar to sail on this ship for many days over and over and over again, I think is the challenge he's had, finding the financing to build it for the cruise industry.
And cruise ships today still sink.
Yeah, absolutely. And they sink more than we know. Especially container ships sink on average about one of them a week all over the world. Cruise ships less commonly, but still, captains get into kind of rush situations. We saw the most famous one probably about 10 years ago, the Costa Concordia, that ship that sank off the coast of Italy. It kind of keeled, hit some rocks and tipped into the ocean and had to be completely dismantled. So it happens. It happens more than we think. And they're not usually international news.
So to jump back in the story for a moment, you actually tracked down and found Doug Woolley. And when you started on this, you, I guess, didn't even know he was still alive.
I assumed he wasn't because his main work with the Titanic and his fascination was really in the 1960s and 70s. The Titanic was found in the 80s. There's a little bit about Woolley found in the 90s, but after that, he kind of fades into irrelevance. And I assumed that was the end of Doug Woolley, but I had found a snippet in a book about where he might live, and I called a business near where he lived in London and asked them to go knock on his door, and by a series of many people, I consider it kind of like trying to interview the Pope, the number of people you would have to go through. It was like that. And I find him alive in East London. He was 83 at the time. He's now 86. He still lives there. And I went to visit him in the days right before the pandemic. And it surprised me very much that I went to him to kind of find out, tell me about this past thing you did in the past and, you know, that you're not doing anymore. And he said, oh, no, I still intend to raise the Titanic. I still intend to be the person who goes down and sees it. I have not stopped and I will never stop. And I realized that his entire life, his entire identity was wrapped up in this one wreck, and he would never let it go. It was his North Star of his life and what had driven him forward for dozens of decades, for many years and at least 4 decades.
Has he read the book?
I don't know if he's read it yet. He's very excited that it exists. He considers this book to be the final domino that will yield his master plan of raising the Titanic. And, you know, whether it will or not, I don't think it will, but he does. And I use him as a kind of a character study in what it means to persevere against all odds, what it means to be tenacious and have fortitude, even when people are mocking you and doubting you for it, of staying true to yourself and your goal your whole life and never giving up.
He does come off a little bit of a lunatic, though.
Yeah.
How do you think he's going to take that?
Well, listen, I mean, lunatics are all around us every day, right? And there's a very thin line between someone like Doug Woolley, who has these grand visions that may or may not ever happen, and someone like Elon Musk, who's also kind of, you know, got this grand visions that may or may not happen, right? He's a dreamer, and he might also be a failure, but he hasn't failed yet. That's what he says, and he never will, because he'll never declare his journey over.
We talked about shipwrecks before and intentional shipwrecks. The Navy had a program for a while that you talk about in the book. Was it CHASE, I think was the acronym for it?
Yes, Operation CHASE.
What did that stand for?
Cut holes and sink 'em.
And they did.
They did. Operation CHASE was a Navy operation classified with the CIA in the 1960s and 70s to basically get rid of all of the chemical weapons that the U.S. had developed for World War II and not used. Mustard gas, nerve gas, radioactive bombs, all these things that were developed in large quantities, not used. And several decades later, the CIA is saying, we need to get rid of this stuff or someone could really get hurt. They hire a bunch of captains and commissioners from the Navy and go out and essentially dump giant canisters of some of the worst chemical weapons on Earth. It's supposed to be in deep water, but you can imagine when some of these captains get these, dozens of tons of radioactive waste on their ship, they want to dump them as soon as possible. Very few records kept about where these things went. Nerve gas especially is very potent. Even a few drops of it could kill a blue whale within minutes. This stuff is still at the bottom of the ocean, has not really been studied, and we don't know exactly how much of it or where it is, but it is a lot.
What was the breakthrough that made it possible to find the Titanic?
We know now, only in the past few years, that the man who found the Titanic, Bob Ballard, who was a young naval officer in 1985, had the benefit of some classified technology that the Navy had developed to essentially enable him to go find 2 nuclear submarines that had sunk in prior years. They wanted to go check on the nuclear reactors behind these 2 subs, the Thresher and the Scorpion. And basically the deal with Ballard was, you go find those 2 submarines, and in whatever time you have left in the North Atlantic, you can go look for the Titanic. And so he had technology that most of the world did not and would not for years. That was the main advantage that he had over all of the others who wanted to find the Titanic. It allowed him to find it. And in the years after he found it, he did what I call the most American of things. He recommissioned this technology for private use, and he sold it to other people interested in the deep sea, particularly those going after minerals and oil, to be able to see and excavate deeper than ever before.
Are there still people regularly going down to the Titanic and poking around?
Oh, yeah. There are tour companies now that for a price, a very high price, will take tours down. You can go on a cruise around the wreck site, and weather permitting, they'll take you down in a vehicle, a small submarine, to go see the wreck and giant floodlights. You could do that next summer. You could do that the summer after. There is regulation around the wreck site. It is considered a cultural heritage site. But provided people don't touch it or submarines don't touch it, generally there's few limits on how many people can go down. The main limits are technologically and financially.
Are you planning to take a trip down there?
I get terribly seasick even on a canoe. I cannot ride a big boat, nor can I get in a underwater vehicle. I would love to see it. I think of all the kind of cultural artifacts in the world, when you think of the pyramids and King Tut and Machu Picchu, the Titanic really is one of them. And as long as it's still there, and it will be there for a while longer, it's one of the great wrecks of all time, and especially it's one of the great stories of the 20th century.
Well, and you tell it so well in the book, Sinkable. For such a grim subject, it's really a fun read, and I recommend it to anybody. It's great stuff.
Thank you, Paul.
Daniel Stone, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Several times in the 20th century, when the Titanic was at risk of fading from public view, new media productions introduced it to new generations, which fueled new rounds in the zeitgeist. You might think that can happen only so many times, and that now, after more than a century and hundreds of movies, expeditions, court cases, and books, including this one, that the Titanic is on the wane. But according to Google, the ship remains at peak popularity as one of the world's most popular search terms almost every day.